Now, I don't think Walter needs much introduction at all to us all. He is, of course, a very distinguished foreign correspondent. He spent 40 years in the media, the print media, the radio world, and I'm sure increasingly in the e-world. He has spent an enormous amount of time in Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, with 3 postings to Japan over a number of years. So he's obviously got very much an insight into the issues which are affecting Japan today. He is the author of 3 books. The title of the first one puzzles me totally, and we might find time to elaborate on that one. Koala no Hon.
The book of koalas.
Right, well, he's obviously very versatile. Serendipity City on Australian Japan and the multifunctional polis, and I remember the times when we were all very caught up with that experiment, which we thought might happen. And didn't, and most recently a very interesting book, I would imagine, which I haven't yet read, would like to, on the lives of mixed-race offspring of Allied servicemen who left Japan following the war, and of course that's been an issue wherever there have been warriors, and I'm quite sure that's a very interesting insight into that aspect of society. Japan is fascinating for a whole variety of reasons, and I'm staggered the room isn't absolutely jam-packed because of the issues that are so interesting in Japan. You know, we know about the economic demise, or the difficulties that Japan has been having economically for a number of years. We know about the social consequences of some of those economic changes. We know about the political rigidities of the system and the stasis in the old system as they struggle to keep governments, to change governments. There's still an enormous number of questions about the Japanese political system and how change occurs. There is, of course, the whole set of issues around the tsunami, which we're perhaps most familiar with for the worst reasons, the dread and the horror of circumstances and life for Japanese still. So many of them not yet able to go back into their own homes. And on top of all of this, for our very important neighbour and still major trading partner, on top of all this, we have the extraordinary challenge, really, or the resurgence of the challenge, or the challenges that are coming from the apparent and real disputes over the islands in the South China Sea in particular. Korea, Japan, China, Russia, all suddenly laying claim to those islands, presumably for territorial waters reasons and offshore rights for fishing and minerals, but I think Walter will be telling us more about that. But it seems very unfortunate for Japan that at this time of great difficulty and the loss of confidence in governments because of the tsunami and a history of, a failure to get political change happening readily, Japan is in a difficult situation, and at this most difficult time is being confronted by this set of international challenges. So Walter brings an enormous background of experience there, and I think we'll see very much the scene from the inside because of his experience. And of course I expect him to reflect on what it means to us as well. So I'd ask you to join with me in welcoming Walter to speak to us this evening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Verrier, for your kind introduction tonight, and it's a privilege to be here speaking to the ACT branch of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. I use these glasses to read, so I can't see you unless I take them off, so I'll be going back and forth. I've just come back from Japan, had 6 weeks there during the period when the disturbances in China caught the public attention and the headlines around the world. Many of you will be aware that Japan will be going to a national election on the 16th of December, which has just been announced. And interestingly, according to some media reports, Prime Minister Noda, whose ruling party looks like it will lose office, nevertheless, he has indicated that he wants to campaign on certain issues which I think bear some relationship to the topic of tonight's discussion. He wants, for example, to prosecute the case for Japan to join the TPP, or Trans-Pacific Partnership. Now, that is a strategy which some people perceive as a way by which Japan can move towards a more multilateral approach to its international trading relationships, because it seems unlikely there will be a progress soon on the proposed free trade agreement between China, Japan and South Korea. So there'll be a number of things in this election campaign, I imagine, which will bear on the issues that we're talking about tonight, which are principally territorial issues. And I'll just reawaken my computer. I don't intend tonight to attempt to weigh up the merits of the various competing claims in the several territorial disputes involving Japan. Such an exercise, I think, would be best left to the International Court of Justice, although this seems unlikely to happen anytime soon. Instead, I'll concentrate on describing the forces which I believe are shaping current events and how these events are perceived in Japan, principally, and why they may be significant for Australia. Far and away the most important dispute is with China over the Senkaku or Dispute Islands, uninhabited specks of land that lie between Taiwan and Okinawa in the East China Sea. They're home to some feral goats who were left there by activists a number of years ago, and a herb, I'm told, that's used in traditional medicine for blood pressure pills, which I think is rather apposite in the present circumstances. Their real importance, however, is their strategic location amid rich fishing grounds and potentially large reserves of undersea oil and gas. Now, the graph at the top upper left of the page shows the steep rise in China's fisheries take from the East China and Yellow Seas, the blue line. The lines below represent the catches of South Korea and Japan. Also take note of the distances of these islands from their three claimants, including Taiwan, and the middle line between Japan and China, which is indicated, I have indicated it there at the bottom. The middle line is the broken red line, and we have distances to Okinawa. Naha is the principal city of Okinawa. The Okinawan island chain extends down further south and is as close as 170 kilometres from the disputed islands. So that's what we're talking about. 5 islands, I think 3 rocks, total land area of 7 kilometres, square kilometres. Now, the dispute escalated in September 2010, I would say, when a Chinese fishing boat ran into 2 Japanese Coast Guard vessels patrolling near one of the islands. The arrest of the fishing boat captain, according to China, contravened a mutual agreement not to apply national laws to breaches of fisheries regulations. Even though the captain was released without being prosecuted, Beijing retaliated by cancelling bilateral exchanges. Then, earlier this year, Tokyo's right-wing governor, Shintaro Ishihara, launched a fundraising campaign to buy 3 of the islands from their private owner, with a plan to erect permanent fixtures on them. The Noda government, anxious to prevent maverick elements dictating events and alarmed by illegal tit-for-tat landings by Chinese and Japanese activists on the islands, intervened and purchased them for the nation. Just before the decision was announced in Tokyo, President Hu Jintao confronted Prime Minister Noda on the sidelines of the ASEAN summit in Vladivostok and warned him, quote, not to make a wrong decision, unquote. Now, Hu's loss of face after Noda ignored the warning partly explains why China calibrated its reaction at such a high pitch. I want to draw attention to 3 particular aspects of this Chinese reaction. The violent protests that erupted in something like 80 Chinese cities in mid-September were not directed solely against official targets, that is, the Japanese embassy and consulates. Protesters turned their fury on business premises and other private assets. Individuals were intimidated, refused service, and in a number of reported cases, physically assaulted. 2, In punishing Japan, China has not hesitated to carry its campaign into other forums and activities. It boycotted the IMF World Bank meeting in Tokyo. It accused Japan before the United Nations of having, quote, stolen the disputed islands. Japanese delegates attending all sorts of international gatherings in recent weeks have made a point of displaying hostility towards the Japanese participants. At a conference of high-level military personnel in Melbourne, according to a report in The Australian, a Chinese general took the opportunity to bring up the memory of a one-time fascist state that bombed Darwin. China claims that a new status quo exists in the East China Sea now. Other nations with an interest in Japan's security, which of course include Australia, are warned not to interfere with this settling of accounts. China has been making conspicuous use, and this is my third point, conspicuous use of paramilitary vessels, naval assets, Coast Guard and fisheries surveillance vessels in particular, to create a new situation on the sea around the disputed islands, with regular incursions into what Japan considers its territorial waters. Beijing seems intent on showing that Japan is now less in control of the islands than it was prior to consolidating ownership of them. I will now elaborate on each of these points. It's generally accepted that a power shift occurred in North Asia in 2010. In that year, China overhauled Japan to become the world's second biggest economy. Now, the Japanese attitude to this power shift, I hasten to add, is by no means one-dimensional. Big business has a major stake in China's economic success. But conservative politicians and the news media generally have exploited it to develop a theme of government weakness and incompetence. The recriminations have grown increasingly shrill since the tsunami and nuclear disasters. Despite the fact that by any objective measure, Japan remains Asia's preeminent economy in industrial, technological and financial terms, many people fear paying too high a price for the country's growing reliance on China. Throughout their modern history, Japanese and Chinese have felt for each other a mixture of fascination and resentment. We are witnessing, I think, what happens when conflicting emotions are jolted out of a delicate balance. Chinese hatred of the Japanese, and I use the word advisedly, is fueled by propaganda and ignorance in many respects. You only have to look at the textbooks that Chinese students read relating the history of the relationship between Japan and China in the last 100 years. Japanese hostility towards the Chinese rests on old prejudices in many respects, but is these days mainly expressed as complaints against against Chinese ingratitude for the aid and investment they've received. Now, this takes a bit of absorbing, but it's a very recent survey published in the Asahi newspaper. And the survey itself was conducted in Japan and China in August and September. So it crosses over the period we're now talking about in terms of the public reaction to the disputed nationalisation of the Senkaku and Dispute Islands. Now, the survey asked respondents in both countries whether relations were going well. Now, the replies were overwhelmingly negative. In Japan, 90% no. China, which has sort of slipped onto the ceiling there, 83% no. Now, below that, you can see what the results were in 2002. And in 2002, as you will see, they were about evenly divided. If you look down below, what are the biggest problems that people mention? Interestingly, perceptions of history. The history problem, or the history wars, are so prominent among the biggest problems both Chinese and Japanese cite in their relationship. The hot topic these days on Japanese talk shows is China's so-called first and second island chain strategy. Although the Chinese have never precisely defined this concept, the first island chain is understood to run from the Kuriles along the coast of mainland Japan to the South China Sea and is more or less straddled by the Senkaku Islands. Now that's looking south from the mainland of China. The perspective is, of course, unusual for us, but that's the way in which, in North Asia, Japan is often seen as a kind of barrier or shield interfering with the projection of power from the mainland. China is acquiring military hardware that would enable it to prevent an outside force projecting power into this zone inside the first island chain. That's the much discussed anti-access and area denial capability against which the Pentagon has framed its air-sea battle plan. If left unchecked, the argument goes, China could extend area denial to a second island chain that reaches to the tip of New Guinea. This area, presumably, is the strategic space that certain commentators would concede to China as a great power. An idea, when viewed from Tokyo at least, that looks premature at best and perilous at worst. According to one senior analyst in Tokyo I spoke with on my recent trip, and I quote him, the, quote, power-sharing argument emboldens China. It signals a right of way for it to expand its activities and display its strength. The thesis, and of course he's referring to Hugh White's thesis, may have relevance sometime in the future, but at present China does not possess the means for constructive projection of power. To encourage the notion that a vacuum exists into which it may expand prematurely is risky. What's at stake for Japan looks like this. Pardon my use of Japanese source material, but I thought in terms of illustrations they were the best I had access to. Now the blue line surrounding Japan encompasses its claims for exclusive economic zones. They overlap Chinese claims in several places and claims by other countries in several places. The United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea confers special rights on a state to exploit resources out to 200 nautical miles from its shores. Although Japan ranks 62nd in land mass in the world, it has the world's 6th largest EEZ claim. I think Australia has the second largest. A lot has been written on this topic lately, so I won't expand too much on it, except to confine myself to just making 2 points. Japan's pursuit of resources security has taken on a much greater urgency since the Fukushima nuclear accident. And China, already a net importer of crude oil, faces an enormous energy deficit in coming decades unless it acts quickly. These developments have implications for Australia. They bear upon the new commitments the government has taken on under our alliance with the United States, as well as on the direction of defence cooperation between Australia and Japan. Officials and academics in China and Japan are aware of the debate going on in Australia over whether we should endorse the rise of China under its present system of authoritarian capitalism, or pursue an engagement predicated on democratic values of transparency, rule of law, and pluralism. To my mind, for what it's worth, the Asian century will not be a contest of language skills, but a contest of values. And while it may be fashionable in this debate to equate the mention of values with righteousness, in the absence of arrests or compensation following the recent violence in China, I think we are entitled to ask, by what standards should nation-states be judged? Some compensation may be forthcoming. Japanese businesses are said to have suffered damages amounting to $120 million. We'll have to wait and see what happens. Just as the worst of the protests were erupting in China, the defence and foreign ministers of Australia and Japan happened to be engaged in 2+2 talks in Sydney. Since then, the head of the ADF, General David Hurley, and Defence Minister Stephen Smith have both made separate trips to Tokyo in the space of a couple of weeks since those 2+2 talks. So information has been exchanged quickly and at the highest level. In the bilateral talks, an item of discussion has been future exchanges of military technology. The Japanese Parliament although now being prorogued, has been considering an amendment to the Self-Defence Forces law that would clear the way for implementation of a Japan-Australia acquisition and cross-servicing agreement, which was signed in May 2010. This could give access by Australia to advanced anti-submarine warfare technology and know-how, a field in which Japan is an acknowledged leader. The Department of Defence here in Canberra, as you'll be aware, is in the initial definition phase of a project to commission a new class of long-range cruise missile-equipped submarines. Japanese defence planners believe China's current purpose, and I'm taking the more broader look now at the motivations behind what's been going on, not specifically the Australia-Japan connection. Japanese defence planners believe China's current purpose is to test the resolve of the US-Japan alliance, which has been under pressure from what might be termed sovereignty advocates in Japan. Those on the left have been demanding a reduced American military presence in Okinawa. Those on the right want to cast off the constraints on Japanese military self-reliance imposed by the post-war constitution. The US has affirmed that the Senkaku Islands come within the scope of its security treaty with Japan, but avoided taking sides on this dispute. This has led to calls from some commentators in Washington, some commentators for Washington, to be more forthcoming. And following President Obama's re-election, the Japanese government has wasted no time initiating talks on new guidelines for military cooperation in case of an attack. It is fair to say that the issue has put a flaw under previously wavering public support in Japan for the alliance. What effect it may have on the outlook for constitutional change is less clear. But Japanese complaints about rising Japanese nationalism presumably anticipate the return, after the coming election, of a new LDP-led government under Shinzo Abe, a noted hawk on foreign policy. Under its 2010 defence plan, Japan has already begun drawing down military assets from Hokkaido in the north and boosting them in the south, most notably by enlarging its submarine fleet. One direct consequence of the current imbroglio has been a decision to bring forward by 6 months spending on additional new Coast Guard vessels. As has been widely reported, Japanese automakers and electronics firms in China have suffered declines in sales of between 30 and 60% in September and October. Chinese visitor numbers to Japan are also sharply down. On the evidence of previous Sino-Japanese quarrels, the switch suddenly turned off is capable of being turned on again fairly quickly, albeit in stages. Japan, in the meantime, I think will want to demonstrate to China that bad relations are harmful to its core interests, including its ambition to obtain greater influence within regional groupings. A decision by Japan, and I alluded to this earlier in terms of the topic being something to be canvassed during the coming election campaign in Japan, a decision by Japan, for instance, to commit to the US-led trade initiative, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, would deliver such a message to Beijing. Moves already underway by Japanese firms to diversify their production bases in Asia and exploit business opportunities in new markets such as Myanmar, Burma, are sure to be portrayed in a similar light. Since 1949, China has engaged in 23 territorial disputes with its neighbours on land and sea. In 6 cases, it used force. In 17, it pursued compromise and offered concessions. It compromised only once in an island dispute. By issuing new charts defining the baselines of the Dispute Islands, the international yardstick for measuring international waters, Beijing seems to have ruled out compromise in this instance. The Japanese government also says it will put the principle of national sovereignty ahead of economic objectives. Chinese government marine and fishery surveillance vessels have entered contiguous waters around the islands on numerous occasions since September 11th, closely monitored by the Japanese Coast Guard, so far without incident. The only clash in which water cannon was used involved Taiwanese vessels. The Taiwanese have not re-entered the fray, and there have been reports that Japan might be willing to grant Taiwan fishing concessions in return for its future cooperation. Chinese fishing vessels lately also have been operating away from the hot zone, and protest ships have not reappeared. Japan's previous failure to stop activists getting ashore is recognised in Tokyo to have been a tactical blunder, and tougher measures can be expected against any future attempts. So long as what I call the dance of the surveillance vessels is skillfully conducted, it may deter wildcat actions and keep the two countries' navies out of each other's way. But the risk of an accident or miscalculation is real. Crisis management, unfortunately, is dependent upon each side's independent assessment of risk, rather than an agreed protocol. China has been making increased use of its maritime law enforcement agencies for so-called rights defence or Weiquan activities, contributing to a more assertive posture overall in the South and East China Seas. Its stated policy is to strengthen the capabilities of these agencies and have them work in closer cooperation with the PLA Navy. Japanese analysts say it has become necessary to factor in these assets when calculating their country's future defence requirements. Some believe China has little interest in settling this dispute because time is on its side. If so, the Japanese government's calculation that it could start rebuilding relations with China once the new leadership was in place today may have been over-optimistic. Fence mending talks have progressed to ministerial level but stalled there. Now, in the time I've left, I want to briefly relate this conflict to the other territorial disputes putting Japan in what I call a three-way squeeze. The Northern Territories are several islands settled and developed by Japan close to Hokkaido that were overrun by Soviet troops in August 1945. The area is in the broken yellow circle, and that's the, of course, enlargement. The dispute over their ownership has indeed prevented the signing of a formal peace treaty between the two countries. At stake again are rich fishing grounds and also control of access routes now used by Russian submarines transiting to and from the Pacific. A visit last July by Prime Minister Medvedev to the nearest of the major islands, Kaneshiro, aggravated Japanese feelings of impotence and insecurity. Russia's use of Chinese and North Korean contract labour on new infrastructure projects there, apart from rubbing salt into the wound, underscores the economic opportunities Japan has foregone by refusing to set aside its territorial claim. The two aspects of this dispute, insecurity and opportunity, have rarely been more starkly on display. Vladimir Putin is due to visit Japan soon, probably in January next year, and attention is being paid to whether this may produce a breakthrough on the dispute. I should point out that expectations have been raised and dashed many times before. On this issue, the no compromise lobby is well entrenched in Japan. The third of the territories in dispute is Dokdo, or Takeshima, a cluster of islets controlled by South Korea but claimed by Japan. Again, fisheries resources are involved, although the issue is really driven by unresolved legacies left over from Japan's imperial era. So far this year, around, believe it or not, 160,000 Korean day trippers have visited this far-flung outpost to wave the flag, including President Lee Myung-bak on more than one occasion. To an outside observer like myself, I find the Japanese reaction has bordered on the hysterical. I've been shocked to see, albeit small groups of agitators roaming Korean areas of Tokyo and Osaka, shouting abuse at shopkeepers and urging passers-by to boycott their goods. Even well-educated Japanese who had welcomed the previous warming in bilateral relations by learning Korean, by watching Korean TV soap operas and enjoying shopping trips to Seoul, seem to have taken President Lee's grandstanding, and that's all it is, as a personal insult. They fail to appreciate the historical grievances feeding into Korea's peculiarly defensive and retributive strain of nationalism. Japan is rapidly ceasing to be seen as a model for Korean development by Koreans. The dominant image, according to one leading academic, is of a country from which the Koreans no longer have anything to learn. This trend lies behind their tendency to focus solely on the history problem. Furthermore, in two landmark decisions, the country's Supreme Court has ruled that the government is obliged to pursue compensation for the so-called comfort women exploited in wartime Japan, as well as for Korean workers conscripted by Japanese companies during the colonial period. Recent events involving Japan, China and South Korea underscore the reality that greater interdependence does not automatically make a community. In this regard, I want to share with you some research I heard quoted recently at Tokyo Symposium. A comparative survey of national sentiment recorded perfect solidarity among South Koreans. Take note of the Chinese figure. The same respondents were also asked, do you identify yourself as Asian? Observe the remarkably low yes figure for the future leaders of the Asian century. Summing up then, the three territorial disputes currently vexing Japan and its neighbours vary in their origins and their trajectories. The Northern Territories are substantial areas of land in an underdeveloped frontier. For too long, the issue has stood in the way of efforts to build Russo-Japanese relations upon a stronger, firmer basis of mutual interest. The Dokdo-Takeshima dispute is more symbolic than strategic, I'd say. A presidential election in South Korea is coming soon. A change of administration and a turning of attention back towards shared security concerns, such as the North Korean issue, may help steady relations with Japan. However, and I think it's an important caveat, I think the next government will move into office with strong constraints on its policy options of improving those relations. Both South Korea and Russia, you can be sure, will also take account of how the current Sino-Japanese tensions play out. Referring to the Senkaku Dayu issue, The Economist magazine warned earlier this year that, quote, the dangers of military miscalculation are too high for comfort. The discomfort level has got considerably worse since then. We see further evidence of a slowing Chinese economy and a return to recession in Japan, according to the latest figures this week. The question now is whether the shared interests arising from the high degree of integration and complementarity of the Chinese and Japanese economies will cause wiser heads to prevail. I'll put up some figures finally to illustrate this point while I take any questions you might have. Thank you.